Good afternoon and welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Today is Wednesday, November 20th, 2024. I'm getting some feedback here. So if you're not on camera, go ahead and mute yourself. And we're going to have a very exciting discussion about one of the proceedings that's been going on at the Federal Communications Commission involving homework, schools, internet access, and Wi-Fi hotspots. And I can't remember if I introduced myself. I'm Drew Clark, CEO of Broadband Breakfast. We are a news and events community focused on better broadband, better lives. We bring people together around getting higher capacity internet and making sure that people have the tools, knowledge, and wherewithal to make use of that high-speed internet. We've been around 17 years and doing events for most of that time. The pandemic maybe caused a revival, and this event series, Broadband Breakfast Live Online, began March 13th, 2020, right as the pandemic was shutting things down. And this event series is a weekly conversation every Wednesday, 12 noon Eastern time, where we try to bring the stakeholders in the industry, regular people as well, in Washington, outside of Washington, the experts with the knowledge, not just on infrastructure, but also on the role of how it impacts education, for example, right? And that's obviously the topic of our discussion today and our expert panel that we'll be hearing from momentarily. Just another couple words about Broadband Breakfast. We do news reporting every single day on better broadband, better lives. We focus on the things that go on in Washington, but outside of Washington too. And in particular, I want to just highlight that the reporting we do is a part of a process where, you know, we're let me just step back a second. What's important about our mission of reporting the news on high-speed internet and being the community that people can talk about these things is that we do have a fundamental belief that we need higher capacity internet. But at the same time, there are lots of different ways of getting there, right? And there's lots of different perspectives. And Broadband Breakfast as a news entity doesn't, take a position about fiber is good and other methods are bad, or that wireless is cheaper and the way to go, or satellite is always good or always bad. I mean, these are multiple technologies, and they're all needed in a way to get us to higher capacity internet. And I think most people in this industry agree, right? And as people learn about the process of broadband infrastructure, they learn these things too. I mean, it's a time of, maybe let's just put it this way, high tempers, right? We've just had an election 15 days ago in this country, and we've had now 3 events. This is the 3rd event since then. And so we're in the process of thinking through what a change in administration will mean for better broadband, better lives. And here at Broadband Breakfast, we're actively engaged in that process through these events, these Broadband Breakfast Live Online events, but also through in-person events, right? And we've got one coming up. We've been saying it for a month or 2 now. It's called Broadband in the Trump administration. It was Broadband in the next administration until 2 weeks ago when we knew the winner of the 2024 election. Now it's Broadband in the Trump administration. And we've got 4 panels at that in-person event, which will be at Clyde's of Gallery Place here in Washington, D.C. And there will be a live stream login for people who want to register and attend. And we're going to cover things like finishing the BEAD project, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Project, spectrum authority, and will Congress ever give the FCC spectrum authority back again? We're going to talk about the Universal Service Fund, its future in the light of some controversial court cases that the Supreme Court may or may not, most likely will, take up, and the future of affordable connectivity in that process. And we have a session on the courts and the role they will play, particularly after the very significant Loper-Bright decision. So these are just some of the topics that pertain to the role of broadband in the Trump administration. And another topic that I think it's fair to say is, what role will proceedings that have been started or are in the process of getting towards conclusion by current FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel? So what role will they play in the transition to the Trump administration and incoming FCC Chairman Brendan Carr? President-elect Trump announced that he would be the chairman of the FTC, 3 days ago on Sunday night, and so there's been news on that and reporting on that, and we're obviously closely following that. But I do think that is in the air and needs to be addressed, because I think there's a premium on making sure there's a way to get proceedings through that have the support of many parties or all parties. Anyway, bit of a long intro. Thank you for listening to that. I am extremely excited in just a moment to introduce our panelists and speakers. I do want to give a thank you to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. We would not be able to do our free Broadband Breakfast Live Online programming without the support of sponsors, including Utopia Fiber, Comcast, Ookla, Wesco, Coos Systems, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance's Community Broadband Networks Initiative, the California Emerging Technology Fund, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, CostQuest, ACA Connects, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. So let's open it up to our view of our panel view, gallery view, and I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order that they will make introductory statements. They'll speak for up to 5 minutes each, and then we will move to a conversation involving each of you, that is to say, each of you who are watching, in addition to each of you who are panelists. So we're going to hear first from Amina Fazula. Amina, great to see you again. Thanks for returning to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. She's the head of tech policy advocacy for Common Sense Media. And in that role, she has played an integral part of projects relating to closing the digital divide. And she's a sought-out expert in the field and routinely presents her ideas to leaders and policymakers in DC. And previously, she was at the United States Public Interest Research Group, where she testified frequently before Congress. Next, we're going to hear from Noelle Ellerson-Ng, who joined the, well, I should say first, her title is Associate Executive Director of Advocacy and Governance at the I guess it's called AASA, the School Superintendents Association. So, Noelle, you could tell us just more in your speech, in your remarks there about AASA, who it is, what it is, but a key role, as I understand it, of what you do is advocate in the federal realm with Congress and the Department of Education on all of the things that superintendents and school districts need, including the technology needs that schools have, which is obviously a key part of what we're going to be talking about here today. Next is John Windhausen, who needs probably no introduction to our audience. He's the executive director and founder of the Shelby, as it's called, coalition, which stands for Schools, Health, Library, and Broadband. And as executive director, he spearheads the organization's membership growth and shapes its broadband policy recommendations. He is also a longtime Washington advocate for organizations like the Association for Local Telecommunications Services and others. And then we have two more. Megan Janicki is the Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives at the American Library Association's Public Policy and Advocacy Office. And Megan leads the broadband and E-rate portfolio and oversees related issues around economic opportunity. Thank you for being with us, Megan, giving us that perspective. And then another new voice with us is Annie Chestnut Tudor, who is a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation's Tech Policy Center. And Annie, you can tell us more about Heritage's role in tech and telecom policy. I will say that she focuses on the center's kids and online safety portfolio, and was previously a Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee staffer for Senator Ron Johnson and a legislative assistant for Senator Mike Lee on tech and telecom. So clearly coming to this topic with a deep background in it. So just to restate our topic again, what happens to homework and Wi-Fi hotspots? And we're kind of coming up on the changes or potential changes to the E-rate funding program, which of course is one of the core programs of the Universal Service Fund. And we look forward to hearing each of your perspectives, plus all of our audience's perspectives on this topic. And with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Amina. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Drew. Excited to join Broadband Breakfast again. As you mentioned, I am head of tech policy advocacy at Common Sense Media, and our focus on homework gap comes from our research background into understanding the connection between technology use, education, and the impact on kids and students. And over the past few years, we've done a lot of research into trying to understand the scale and the scope of the homework gap. And what we found was that, so two things were clear to us. Back in 2019, we found that there was increasing evidence that the lack of access at home was distorting how schools were able to take advantage of digital tools for education. So sort of distorting whether or not, even if a school was well equipped with internal networking and training for teachers, if those kids went home and essentially had even if they had a one-to-one device program, if those devices turned into bricks when they went home, it made a difference to how teachers would proceed with incorporating digital innovations into curriculum. And, that led to our understanding or deepening of our research work to try to understand the scope and scale of the homework gap. And what we found was that there was about 16 million kids in a persistent homework gap. This is K-12. And what that means is that they didn't have access to the connectivity or the devices that they needed to be able to meaningfully engage in education, to continue their work at home. And while there have been a lot of different efforts over the past few years to temporarily support students, there hasn't been any kind of permanent modernization. And this E-rate proceeding is an opportunity to take some of the lessons from our temporary efforts, like the Emergency Connectivity Fund, and apply some of those positive lessons to modernizing E-rate, which would offer potentially a more permanent and lasting support for all those kids that we've identified as being part of this persistent home gap.
Great. And do you have anything more to say right now, or are you giving the time back?
Well, I'll give the time back and pass it to Noel.
Wonderful.
Well, I'm just going to pile on to everything Amina said, basically. But first of all, thank you to Drew and the team at Broadband Breakfast for the invitation to be here. Per what Drew teed up in my introduction, at AASA, the School Superintendents Association, we're the national professional organization representing and serving the nation's public school superintendents. I head up our advocacy work. So that's all the fun that we get to have with the federal government in areas where they will advance a policy or consider changes that would impact the nation's public schools. We're there to engage. And so, like Drew correctly identified, yes, that's us working with Congress and the Department of Ed, but we are anywhere, any agency that there's policy. So directly here, that includes the Federal Communications Commission, but I've spent time at the IRS, I've spent time at Health and Human Services, we've spent time at Homeland Security. If they're going to move policy, we're going to try to help them to make it beneficial to schools. So as we talk more broadly about expanding E-rate to Wi-Fi hotspots, I think it's really important to frame up the underlying conversation that became the stage or the impetus for this move by Chairwoman Rosenworcel. She's not acting unilaterally because she woke up one day and thought it was a great idea. She's a tireless advocate for E-rate and connectivity more broadly. But I also think she was drawing on one of the core principles of our representative democracy, which is checks and balances. Congress had long been aware of the reality of a homework gap. The homework gap existed before COVID. The idea that we had upwards of 25% of our nation's school students unable to access a reliable internet at home to do their learning, which might have been okay in the mid 90s when your learning and homework wasn't internet based, but the idea that we were okay and uncomfortable, like comfortably uncomfortable with the fact that we're just going to let that homework gap persist and exacerbate educational opportunity and the broader conversation about what internet access to home means in general for engaging with civic society, pursuing jobs, pursuing FAFSA, finding out ways to connect and grow community. To the point of E-rate, congressional inaction allowed the homework gap to persist, and COVID just shone a light on something that had long existed, and it forced the hand of Congress because our nation's schools closed down in light of an unprecedented pandemic while we learned whether or not schools could safely reopen, and the option had to become remote learning, and you can only do remote learning if you have access. And the quick patch that Congress is able to come up with was the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which did include E-rate to homes, which did include internet-enabled devices. And so the foundation for Chairwoman Rosenworcel was Congress did act when given the opportunity to continue to fund the program to shore up some of the homework gap. They didn't. And the chairwoman, through her leadership, identified her Learn Without Limits initiative, which is a three-pronged proposal. And so when we look at Wi-Fi hotspots from AASA's perspective, we see it as a check and balance. This is a federal administration and an administrative agency taking a play on a federal policy that had a proven track record that one other branch chose to examine and exercise, but let cease. And so to the extent that we're talking today about the legality of their decision to do that, I'll save those comments for later. But the Learn Without Limits proposal is advanced by the Chairwoman Rosenworcel, is something AASA endorses outright, all three proposals. So E-rate for Wi-Fi hotspots, E-rate on Wi-Fi on buses, and then the cybersecurity pilot. It's a trifecta there. I will tee up and we'll leave it for the broader conversation too. This conversation was teed up as we sit and wait to see the consequences of the consequential decision coming out of the Fifth Circuit, which questions the constitutionality of the underlying funding mechanism for the broader Universal Service Fund. If that goes an unfavorable way, we don't even need to answer whether or not the FCC should have done this for E-rate, because there's a good chance E-rate won't exist in its current iteration. So like any good writer, I'll leave you with that cliffhanger and yield my time to Drew, or I believe John.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for bringing up that Fifth Circuit case, which obviously could have very significant case. It's been the decision rendering E-rate USF unconstitutional has been stayed pending a further review. But anyway, let's turn it over to John and Shelby and the role you've played on this issue.
Well, thank you, Drew. Very nice to be with you and everybody on this panel. The Shelby Coalition spearheaded a lot of this work to allow the E-rate program to fund hotspots and wireless connectivity and devices. So as an example, Shelby filed a petition for rulemaking back in January of 2021, along with the American Library Association and Common Sense and several other organizations. And we specifically asked the FCC to make E-rate funding available for this purpose. And the FCC put it out for comment. And kudos to FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel, because we coordinated that with her office. And we filed our petition in January. The comments that were received were almost overwhelmingly positive because of the urgent need to connect students and library patrons during the pandemic. Even the industry was supportive of our proposal. But then it became put on hold because Congress, in its wisdom, created the ECF program. And a lot of kudos to Senator Ed Markey and Joey Wender, who put that ECF legislation together. That was enormously successful. And I think over the last 3 years,
Emergency Connectivity Fund, right? Just to define
the emergency exactly, that's right. Which Congress appropriated that $7 billion to fund hotspots and cellular service to these low-income consumers. And I think the evidence shows that the FCC has compiled an enormously positive impact. So just to give you one quick anecdote, and then I'll step back to give the national perspective. But the city of Oakland, California, was really quite a turnaround. So before the pandemic started, only 12% of low-income students and 25% of all students had internet access and an internet device at the home. After the ECF program was in effect, 2 years later, Oakland was able to connect 98% of the students in that school district to the internet, with 36,000 laptops and more than 11,500 hotspots to low-income public school students. So that's just one example of what happened around the country. And I think what I was particularly struck by is that the FCC found that more than 18 million students benefited from the ECF program, or approximately 1/3 of all K through 12 students in the United States. And that's using data from USAC. So that had enormous benefits, but unfortunately, when the funding ran out, a lot of those students lost their devices, lost their internet connections. So then it became clear that really we needed the FCC to step forward and find a way to continue that program. And that's exactly what Chairwoman Rosenworcel did, along with the other two Democratic commissioners at the FCC, in adopting this hotspot lending provision and amending the E-rate program to allow that funding to go forward. Now, unfortunately, Commissioner Carr dissented from that decision. And I want to be clear and say I have enormous respect for Commissioner Brendan Carr. He's very thoughtful, articulate, and as opposed to some of the other Trump nominees, he's very qualified to be chairman of the FCC. So we look forward to working with him. But in this case, Commissioner Carr's dissent points up 4 areas where he thought that the FCC exceeded its jurisdiction. He claimed in his dissent that there was no limit on ratepayer dollars in this hotspot lending decision. There was no limit on locations, no sunset date, no protection against increasing consumers' monthly bills. Well, in fact, when you take a close look at the order, there are measures that address all of his concerns in that regard. And the FCC, for instance, adopted a very specific budget calculation for each school and each library to use based on the number of students they serve or based on the size of the library. So there is a cap on funding. It is not out of control. The FCC further said that if there is an overall E-rate cap and the funding for these hotspots, devices and services would not threaten that E-rate cap, but if it does threaten the E-rate cap, then priority will be given to existing and traditional E-rate supported services. There are a number of other obligations and requirements too that schools and libraries have to include in their acceptable use policy, that these services are to be used primarily for educational purposes. They therefore fit the integral, immediate, and proximate to school library functions test that is then the FCC's precedent for administering the E-rate program. Furthermore, there's a 3-year budget. And so the FCC said, we're going to revisit this program every 3 years and determine whether it should continue and what the budget should be for the next 3-year period. Competitive bidding also applies as a way to produce more efficient funding of these networks and to make sure there's a limit on any waste, fraud, and abuse. So there are a lot of very careful protections that the FCC built into the hotspot lending decision. Now, I wouldn't say the program is perfect, because there are still some modifications that the Shelby Coalition is promoting. For instance, we think that it's too dedicated to traditional commercial mobile services and doesn't really allow for devices used with CBRS spectrum, doesn't deal with devices that have built-in LTE capability. We can talk about those more later. So there are some changes we would like to see, but in general, the FCC is on a really good path, and we need to solve this homework gap that Amina's research talks about, and we need to find a way to solve this. And the E-rate program has a long-standing history of success, and we support the FCC in implementing this program and continuing it in the new administration.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Let's turn to you, Megan, to give your thoughts on this.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Megan Janicki with the American Library Association Public Policy and Advocacy Office. ALA is the leading voice for libraries. We have over 50,000 members, and we've been advocating for this issue for well over a year. So as many of you know, of course, libraries are the cornerstone of digital equity and opportunity in this country. Libraries are the go-to place for millions of people who need access to technology, resources, and expert guidance on evaluating online information. ALA supports making Wi-Fi hotspots eligible for E-rate funding. Libraries already use hotspots and other technologies to close the digital divide and support their communities with off-premises Wi-Fi. Libraries started circulating hotspots over 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago, and then continued with the various programs, including the Emergency Connectivity Fund. And nearly 50% of public libraries are lending Wi-Fi hotspots currently. That's according to the 2023 Public Library Association Technology Survey. And that's about a 14% increase from just 3 years prior. So we've really seen this take off. And E-rate can provide sustainable funding to sustain and expand those efforts. Library hotspot lending programs help students complete assignments and communicate with teachers. Job seekers prepare for and take certification exams for needed career pathways. Adult learners study for the GED and engage with online learning tools, and families connect with social services and participate in civic, social, and community-based activities. We see that library hotspot lending is a complement to other broadband programs and solutions that provides flexibility to individuals who lack home internet or may not have sufficient access for the needs of their household. ALA and library advocates nationwide are supportive of and thankful to the Commission for taking the important step towards modernizing the E-rate program, recognizing diverse connectivity needs and challenges, and libraries as an essential part of the solution for the homework gap. E-rate funding for hotspots builds sustainability for libraries in all communities to lend hotspots and connect their patrons. And it also acknowledges that broadband and technology access are essential to modern life. We're really pleased with the program rules. They provide flexibility to libraries to develop their own circulation practices and rely on existing lending policies. Libraries are clearly already experts in circulating resources, have been doing so, since their inception for hundreds of years. So acceptable use policies can be determined at the local level as it's currently written, and include both educational purpose and unmet need. Patrons will not have to declare that they lack home internet or sign anything in order to check those out. And this is a major win for libraries and will go a long way towards benefiting the libraries themselves for making it easier to manage and manage the E-rate hotspot lending, and it will benefit the local communities as well by reducing stigma and making more hotspots available. Libraries and communities across the country have developed Wi-Fi hotspot lending programs to address the digital divide and connectivity needs of their patrons. We've seen large library systems like Harris County in Texas that loans out thousands of hotspots, and small library systems like Rowan County in Kentucky that may lend as few as 5 to 10. Libraries work with local community partners to identify communities in need and to develop circulation practices that fit that. I'll share just a couple of quick examples from libraries just to give you an idea of how this looks and how this might work with the new E-rate guidelines. So for example, the Chicago Public Library launched Internet to Go Wi-Fi in 2015, and the short-term goal was to increase users' comfort with digital technology and increase users' perception that the internet is relevant for them and how it supported their education, career, social, and civic goals. So really encouraging adoption. In fact, it was piloted in communities where they were least connected, and was kind of coupled with showing the different low-cost internet options that were available in Chicago. So partnered with cyber navigators that could aid patrons in signing up for the internet access. So really seeing the hotspot lending as kind of an in-between step and in hopes to get people connected and understand how the internet and adopting the internet. So Chicago Public Library continues to loan hotspots to underconnected communities based on the current interest and demand. And then we heard a story from during the Emergency Connectivity Fund of Lois Nelson Public Library in the rural area of Princeton, Texas, who helped a college student continue attending classes after an unexpected setback. College student had been to college on an athletic scholarship and tore their ACL and had to return home. Unfortunately, returning home to her rural community meant that there was no internet at home. So by working with the library to get a hotspot, able to complete schoolwork during that semester that she was recovering. And so just a couple of ideas of how this might look, and I will leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you for your perspectives. Let's turn to our final panelist, Annie Chestnut-Tudor. Floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm with the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank here in Washington that helps shape conservative policy. I'm in the Tech Policy Center, and I primarily work on our kids and online safety portfolio. And I also draft some of our comments for federal rules in the Federal Register. So I will provide a counter perspective to this rulemaking. We have engaged through this rulemaking through 2 comments. We submitted an ex parte comment in March to the proposed rulemaking. And then in October, we submitted a comment to the further notice of proposed rulemaking. So essentially, in our comments, in the first one, we noted that the rule was arbitrary and lacked evidence, and how it would lead to higher completion rates of homework. And we laid out our concerns and how the rule would lead to more screen time, which has negative ramifications for kids' health, such as sleep deprivation, ADHD, anxiety, depression, aggression, and impulsivity, among other issues. And importantly, that it obfuscates parental authority by letting kids to check out internet devices for use outside of potentially parental and teacher oversight. And while kids may use the hotspots to do their homework, it's almost certain that they will use them for entertainment purposes. For example, according to Pew Research, 95% of kids use social media. And we believe that the proposal lacks sufficient limitations in how the hotspots may be used. We also are concerned that it will lead to excessive spending. There are insufficient E-rate funds, and it could lead to higher universal service fund fees. It could also demand more appropriations from Congress, which has already spent over $150 billion in subsidies to meet the program's obligations. Lastly, regardless of policy merits of the program, we believe that the FCC lacks the authority. Section 254 of the Communications Act says that the E-rate funds may only be used for telecommunications and information services in school classrooms and libraries, not offsite purposes. And as some other panelists have noted, that this program essentially is expanding the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which was explicitly authorized and appropriated by Congress in the American Rescue Plan Act. And that was in response to a need for at-home learning, since they're the government mandated lockdowns, schools were closed, and kids were at home. And there was a need for homes that didn't have broadband access. So this was a program for that time. It expired at the end of the emergency health order a year after that. And so that was the program finally expired in June 2024, and it about $7 billion was appropriated and used for that program. And now schools are back in person, and so there is not that explicit need. And we think that the FCC would be better served in administering other broadband programs. We also have the NTIA BEAD program, $42 billion for deploying broadband. And there are other programs that can help these homes without broadband access get that broadband. And ultimately, if this is a program that Congress wants to continue, then they will need to provide that direct authority for the FCC in order to use the E-rate for Wi-Fi hotspots outside of schools and libraries. And I know part of today's discussion is about the future of this program. So as it's been noted, there will of course be a flip in the balance of power at the FCC in January. And with Brendan Carr nominated as chair, and he has dissented to this proposal, as had Nathan Symington. So the fate is, it could change. We could have a CRA from Congress that could be a tool that could be used. There's also a petition to reconsider the rule. So if the FCC approved that petition, then they could reconsider the rulemaking and vote it down. That would probably take more time because the FCC will have to replace Jessica Rosenworcel's commission spot with a new Republican commissioner, and that timeline is uncertain. So I'll end there.
Okay, well, we definitely have a diversity of views on this topic, and we appreciate that. So here's my first factual question, and then I don't know, let's just call it a temperature taking question. The factual question is, could anyone else, and Annie did mention this, the Emergency Connectivity Fund as a quote unquote precursor, right? She's mentioned that expired in June, and I just wanted to kind of get others' take on the ECF as a kind of a model for this effort. And again, I think that Annie has put front and center the question of, is this a type of partisan measure that is destined or doomed to not succeed, given that we are 2 months to the day from a transition, and it's unlikely to get something through unless there's a broader support. So I guess the question I'd ask all the panelists is there any aspect of this that does command bipartisan support or not? Okay, and so let's actually, if you don't mind, John, me directing this to John about the ECF, since you first raised that.
Well, thanks, Drew. As Annie just said, the FCC, our current chairwoman, Rosenworcel, is expected to step down around Inauguration Day of January 20th. So that, if so, that would leave the commission with a 2-to-2 split. So it would be a bit deadlocked on making any changes to the hotspot lending program until they provide a third Republican, fifth commissioner is confirmed by the Senate. So I expect the hotspot lending program to continue to operate. You know, it's operating right now because the eligible services list was published by the FCC, and now schools and libraries are preparing to submit their applications for E-rate funding with and asking for funding for hotspots. So that will be going forward in this next year. Now, is it possible that then Chairman Carr will reverse that decision once the commission is fully up to speed? Yes, that is a possibility. I would like to, instead of reversing the decision, I think we would like to engage with Chairman Carr in a way to recognize the value of this program And if there are tweaks or changes that could be made to accommodate his concerns and the concerns that Annie raised, I think we're willing to have those conversations with the FCC. So in other words, I think we're continuing to learn through the process. ECF provided one foundation for learning. We're going to learn again in this next round of E-rate funding that is about to be applied for, and then we can reconsider how the program should operate going forward.
Could you just delineate, John, what is like done law has been approved as an order and what is still in the realm of potentials, right? Of what we've been talking about on Wi-Fi and hotspots in schools, what is the order that's actually in place right now?
Well, the FCC adopted the order in July of 2024, and it was published in the Federal Register at the end. I'm sorry, it was decided in June. It was published in July. So there are petitions for reconsideration that have been filed. One petition that Annie mentioned is to try to reverse the whole decision. Our petition for reconsideration that shall be filed was to make it more technology neutral. And we suggested that the FCC should allow some of these other equivalent technologies also to be funded. The FCC has not ruled on those petitions for reconsideration yet. And, it's an open question whether they will, because Congress wrote, both the House and the Senate leaders wrote to Chairwoman Rosenworcel, asking her not to proceed on any controversial matters until after Inauguration Day. So it's traditionally called a pens down letter. But the order that was adopted last summer is in effect right now.
Okay.
And schools and libraries are applying for that funding in the next E-rate window, which we expect will be January through March of next year. And so then the FCC presumably will fund those if those applications meet the requirements that the FCC set up in that order earlier this summer.
Okay. No, thanks for clarifying that. And again, we like to start with a base of knowledge, but sometimes we need to go below that base and educate people on where things stand right now. Let me give the other people, the other panelists, Amina, Noel, Megan, and Annie as well, you're an opportunity to react on this question of the going forward stuff, what has a chance, and your thoughts on the kind of other potential measures, the petition for reconsideration that's been mentioned. Annie also referred to the Congressional Review Act, which is kind of a opportunity for a Congress to reverse an agency action. I think it's 60 days in advance of the change of administration. So Amina, Noel, and Megan, as well as Annie.
So I would jump in. Normally I would look at a CRA, but I believe the final rule on the E-rate application was more than 60 days before this admin. So I'm not sure a CRA would be permissible. Right. I'm going to do what I did in my, first of all, align with everything John said. But like I did with my framing comments, I think a little bit broader context matters, because if I was a betting woman, but I'm not going to hold my breath for Congress to fix this or continue this. They had the opportunity to create it. They had years to create a conversation and lead a conversation about providing internet access at home, either through the existing FCC statute or through their own other broadband initiatives. And they only acted when backed against a wall. And even then they did that in a partisan manner. I believe by being in the American Rescue Plan, that was only supported by Democrats. So if we take that at face value for what it is, two other important points. When you look at the history of the broader Universal Service Fund, which funds all 4 programs, they created it in its modern iteration in 1996, but Congress hasn't paid into it a single penny since then. And I think when we look at how Republicans campaign in on a platform of fiscal restraint and responsibility and whittling down the size of government and overreach, I don't think asking them to pay for a program that they haven't paid for has a lot of viability, let alone asking them to pick up a piece of legislation that in a bipartisan Congress or with split leadership, they didn't get done. I think that matters. I think the third piece of context that's helpful here is the incoming chair of the Commerce Committee, I believe, is Senator Cruz, is what for all intents and purposes. And when we look at how he has messaged on some of these conversations, I would not hold my breath on that as well. Something I hadn't noodled on until I heard John really talk about it. One thing that could, because we support the program, so seeing it go away without a backup plan in place would really be disruptive. if there's something that could complicate it, it's the confluence of timelines, right? The current chairwoman will step down around January 20th. The incoming chairman Carr will be appointed and confirmed at some point, but they'll need a majority.
Doesn't need to be confirmed because he's
Well,
already commissioner.
That's right. You're right. But they're going to need a third chair to make any changes. And
Third commissioner, yeah, of course.
yeah, a third commissioner, a third Republican appointee. And so the thing that John just pointed out is the timing. I'm not sure that this FCC or even Congress wants to disrupt applications that have been submitted in good faith with school budget dollars, because districts and libraries, our library partners, have to do the same thing, put their own money on the line. They're not going to want to disrupt that. So to the extent that there might be a disruption, I think because of the confluence of the timelines, it's far more likely to see something later in the calendar year for the next application cycle.
Okay, thanks for that context. We got a lot of questions, so we can go on but if you want to weigh in, Amina, Megan, and Annie, please.
I would just add in agree with John and Noel on everything. ALA is certainly moving forward with this program and helping libraries to get prepared for their application. As John said, it was passed, it is active. The hotspots are on the eligible services list, so we're moving forward in that vein. And ALA is also supportive of Shelby's petition for reconsideration. We're interested in seeing other technology neutral alternatives, maybe, into the future. We're obviously excited to get the hotspots out now, but I think that's an interesting opportunity, as many libraries have leveraged alternative technologies to connect their communities off premises.
Annie, to kind of come back to your point, what would you like to see done? Like given the fact of what's happened thus far, and what other points have just been made about the 2-2 commission?
Yeah, like John said, it is in process right now. So for now, it will continue. I think I would like to see some changes, given that, ultimately, we agree with Commissioner Carr that the FCC does not have the authority. So I think in some ways this program will have to end as it is right now. And so whether that is done through a new rule change eventually at the FCC or a CRA, I think Congressional Research Service has estimated the CRA look back window starts August 1st and this rule finalized August 20th. But we won't know ultimately until the end of the Congress and how many session days they take in December.
So I want to get into our questions we've got from our audience, because we got a lot of them. So one kind of baseline question is, what is a Wi-Fi hotspot and where they are used? And I'm going to pair that with another question about Wi-Fi and this is Dan Smith's question. The first one was Michael Pitch's question. The second one, Dan Smith's. In many cases, it would have been less expensive to provide a cable/fiber connection rather than a hotspot. Could we talk a moment about kind of what's a hotspot, what's included, and sort of wireline versus the hotspot wire, which is commonly associated in common parlance with a wireless technology. So we'd love to hear everyone's take, or anyone who would like to weigh in on that.
Well, Drew, I can get started. The FCC adopted a very narrow definition of a hotspot that has to use the particular Wi-Fi frequencies of 802.11. And that means that only the traditional hotspots used by the big three mobile carriers are eligible to provide service to those hotspots. And that's one of the unfortunate things about the FCC's order, is that there are other technologies that are provide equivalent mobile service or wireless service that could have been used. But, hotspots are great when they work, but there are significant areas of the country where traditional mobile cellular service does not work all that well, and it may be good for phone calls, but it's not strong enough for video instruction and online education. So that's why we've supported the idea that some of these other wireless technology should also be eligible for this funding. If we really want to address the homework gap and the digital divide for the most rural students, well, sometimes these other technologies like CBRS or EBS spectrum are available that could solve that need. Now, the questioner also makes a good point that wireline connections should also be eligible for funding, and that's a fair point too. That if a wireline connection is cheaper, more affordable than a wireless connection, that there's no reason why that shouldn't also be eligible. So we are in favor of a technology neutral policy. But unfortunately, the FCC's definition is really tied to one particular technology, which we think makes the program not as good as it could be.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, we had found in laying out sort of the options of, how do you connect students at home so that they can continue their education and complete homework assignments, having access to wireline connection could also be cheaper, but also provide you the flexibility of future-proofing your connectivity needs so that as your tech specs change, as different applications, like, for example, innovations through AI, there may be various needs. And so you have more flexibility there. One thing that was explored through ECF and during the pandemic was the concept of bulk purchasing. I think the logistics of hotspot lending, actually having a device like a little puck that you hand out, can be easier in some ways for a school to administer than doing sort of bulk purchasing of wireline service. So I can see why there may be a reluctance to do that, but then the potential cost savings and the ability to sort of future-proof what you're investing in is really attractive when you think about a wireline option.
Okay, who else wants to weigh in on this wireline question? All right, we've got a question here, and let me ask it kind of in two ways. This is basically saying, Mark Rivas is saying that it is a partisan proposal only to the extent that spending any money to help the less fortunate is contrary to Republican policy. That's Mark's question. Okay, so I'm going to ask the question this way. Annie, you've been critical of this, and actually, I probably wanted to say the other question, which is, does the Heritage Foundation believe that homework should be done at school only? How does a child without internet access do any research for their homework? So that's probably the more appropriate question. So, I mean, serious question, right? Like, what is your stance, Heritage's stance on the appropriateness of doing homework not at home through subsidized internet connections? And maybe the question I would ask the others besides Annie is, Annie raised a lot of points about kind of child safety, and that is a concern that many parents clearly have. And I do wonder what others sort of say in reaction to those points that Annie made in her opening statement. So let's let you go first, Annie, on the question from Mark Revis.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are in favor of more homes getting access to broadband, and so that's where I was why I made that comment about the other broadband programs that have been authorized and appropriated and the need to deploy those funds. Also, I think that it is the responsibility of schools and teachers, administrators to be aware and mindful of what their students' needs are or their abilities at home. And so are there ways that do all assignments need to be done with internet, or are there other alternative options? Also, is there time provided for them at school if they need it because they don't have that access at home? And so I'm not an expert in education policy, but I think that there are alternatives because this program was ultimately the Emergency Connectivity Fund was created so that kids could participate in school while they were at home when going to school in person was not an option. And but now going to school in person is an option.
Okay, so to be clear, do you support the notion of supporting kids with access to the internet not at school?
Yes.
Okay, all right. But it just with more safeguards, right? With more like some of the points you made earlier about access to the device. I suppose I should look more carefully at the proposals you filed, right? Because you did make comments in this proceeding, and I appreciate that you are coming from that. Let me ask the question of the others. Please go ahead, Noelle.
So I would jump in, and here I'm a little bit off topic, but I think that the very constitution, the authority of the FCC to have taken this action is actually under challenge in the Fifth Circuit in one of the Moloch cases, in part stemming from the Moloch Family Foundation concern about unfettered internet access and its correlation to social media and what that does for student wellness and health. And so I think there's a very clear through line there. At the same time, AASA holds space for the fact that programs like E-rate are about connectivity. And if we really entangle that you can only have connectivity with absolute student safety, we can preclude some internet access, right? And that's a problem. I'm not saying anyone on this call has said that, but we engaged with a bill from Senator Ted Cruz last summer. It was called the Social Media Safety. It was a bipartisan bill with Senator Schatz and Senator Ted Cruz, and it said any school district or library receiving E-rate would have to guarantee that they have in place internet filters or risk losing their E-rate dollars. And on a surface level, that seems really good. And one of the areas where I drove people bonkers is we opposed, even though data demonstrates that 88% of districts have in place filters that block social media already. So why would I oppose a bill when 88% of districts are already doing something? One, that means your bill is redundant and performative. Use your political chits on something else to advance a different, more substantive manner, because there's other ways to achieve enhanced student safety through maybe FERPA or COSA or COPPA, the other federal policy privacy statutes that have been simmering through the House and the Senate. And another core tenet, and I'm speaking more broadly for the EdLink Coalition, of which there are members here, E-rate at its core is a program designed for connectivity. And to measure a connectivity around whether or not it is limiting access to content, when the statute specifically prohibits federal articulation of what can be offered on that network, it's measuring a program for zebras that buy oranges, if that makes sense. It doesn't make sense because the two aren't related, but you shouldn't measure a program designed for connectivity on whether or not in an arbitrary, like on a single manner, it's protecting student safety. I can say something that sounds that egregious though, because one of the provisions in place with CISA, the Children's Internet Safety Act, is that you have to adopt filtering. And the overwhelming majority of districts do have filters in place that do prohibit access to social media. And the hard reality here is you can have superintendents that completely ban all social media, and all it takes is one device off network, and social media is in your schools. And so there's also the conversation about, is it abstinence from social media, or do we have a responsibility to talk about responsible internet and social media consumption and being aware and teaching kids digital literacy, media literacy, and how the algorithms are designed to help exacerbate some of those lesser desirable outcomes. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on this topic?
Well, Drew,
Yeah,
I would like to just clarify
Please.
one quick thing and then turn it to the next speaker. But the Moloch case challenging the E-rate hotspot lending order was filed in the Fifth Circuit, but then it was dismissed because the Molochs had also filed a petition for reconsideration with the FCC. So there is no current appeal of the E-rate hotspot lending order that's going on right now. There is an appeal going forward of the FCC's school bus Wi-Fi decision, and that was briefed and the oral arguments were held a few weeks ago. So we expect a decision from the Fifth Circuit on the school bus Wi-Fi challenge in the next few months. But not the hotspot lending is not under appeal right now.
But these are all part of this effort, right? That is to say, the school bus Wi-Fi and the E-rate lending, right?
Well, I think if you're going to summarize them together, it's about the family association focus. The Moloch Association is premised on student safety stemming from their concerns for the loss of their child. And that's how I would read those cases. John, perhaps you have a different one, but their catalyst is looking at constraints on appropriate access to internet because of what it can mean for internet access, social media use, and bullying.
Okay. Megan, you wanted to weigh in. Not sure it was exactly this point, but go ahead, Megan.
I was just going to say, I think one piece that we're leaving out here is that the definition of education is much broader than what we're talking about here. So for library patrons, we're talking about adult learners, we're talking about job seekers, we're talking about families who may have internet at home but don't have enough to support multiple students that are working at homework at the same time, or families that are on at the same time. So just wanted to add that to this conversation, but otherwise totally agree with John and Noel too.
The time has sped by. I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to offer some closing thoughts. You feel free to address any of the questions we've had or things that you wanted to say about what others have said. Clearly, there's a lot here, and I know I've certainly learned a lot from this conversation. I hope others have as well. Can we go in reverse order? Give Annie you the chance to say something in closing, and 30 seconds or so, and then we'll just kind of again go in reverse order and end with Amina. So Annie, please, your final thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Glad to participate and provide a counter perspective to the panelists.
Thank you for being with us. And let's turn now to Megan. Yes,
thanks for this conversation. Thanks for having me here and to talk about libraries and specifically and the great role that libraries have in closing the digital divide.
John?
Just a really quick legal point. I know that some have said that the hotspot lending decision is illegal or unconstitutional because it doesn't, the statute refers to classrooms. And I would just say, yes, the E-rate statute refers to classrooms, but it doesn't say only classrooms. And there's a lot of legal authority in Section 254C3 that the FCC can use and has used to justify its hotspot lending decision to allow funding to go off campus, where education is increasingly occurring. Even after the pandemic, there's a lot more online learning that's going on from home than there used to be. And so that's why it's appropriate for the FCC to consider devices like this hotspot lending program.
Great. Thank you very much, John and Noel.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciated hearing from Amina and Annie. I talk with John and Megan on the regular, but this is an important conversation and we appreciate the work of Breakfast Broadband.
Thank you. Amina, get the last word for us.
Thanks for having me. You know, from my perspective, I think that, you know, we understand that there are kids who definitely need support to be able to meet their educational needs through technology access. That's not just in school, but it's also at home to be able to make sure that they are just as well prepared as their most well-resourced counterparts. And ensuring that everybody has that access to opportunity is really critical. And on the point of child safety, which Common Sense takes really seriously, we're here supporters of COSA and CAPA, and updates to ensure kids' online safety. There is, I think, ample opportunity for us and Annie and others to work together in figuring out how we can make sure that as kids are using technology, that they're able to maximize the benefits while minimizing the harms.
Well, again, that will have to be our last word. Before I thank our panelists, I want to remind you next week, we're going to be talking about the next steps on digital equity projects. The week after that, permitting on federal lands. And the week after that, we will be live in person on December 12th, broadband in the Trump administration. On behalf of our panel, Amina, Megan, John, Noel, and Annie, I'm Drew Clark, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.